Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and a while back I did a video that explained how the Super Nintendo port of Wolfenstein 3D used Mode 7 in a clever and interesting way. I thought it was about time I showcased more games that were really inventive and unique in how they used this famous mode, and explained exactly how they did it. I also wanted to focus on some games that don't get mentioned too often when talking about Mode 7. It's about time they had their time in the spotlight. So let's get right into it. Before I start talking about specific games, I just wanted to give a very brief high-level overview of how Mode 7 actually works. While the final result that's displayed on the screen may look as if the background itself is rotating or zooming, that's technically not what's going on. The background isn't actually moving, it's staying in place. Instead, some complex maths is manipulating the player's current viewpoint in relation to the background, which is visualized in this debugger with what I like to call view lines. The closer together these lines are, the closer the background appears to the player, and they get further apart the further away the background appears. Many games also combine this with scrolling, often creating a kind of triangular or cone shape with the view lines that remains consistent relative to the player's position as they move. In these cases, Mode 7 is also being combined with HDMA to create the perspective you see, as it can't do this on its own. These view lines also show how rotation is done by manipulating the player's viewpoint, like what would happen if you were filming something and you rotated the camera, which can also be combined with scrolling. If you want to know more about how Mode 7 works on a technical level, I'll leave a link to a video by Retro Game Mechanics Explained in the description. Just be warned that you'll need to brush up on your linear algebra and trigonometry skills to fully understand it. Alright, let's get into some games. First up, let's deep dive into Super Turrican 2, which is one of the best games that demonstrate an uncommon sub-mode, I guess you could call it, of Mode 7. This was called EXTBG, which is often interpreted to mean extra background, although that's not really what it's doing. Mode 7 only allows for one background layer, but what EXTBG did was basically duplicate a Mode 7 tile map into a second layer. This duplicate was identical to the original and was essentially stuck on top of it, so it could not be independently rotated, zoomed or scrolled. It had to do what the main Mode 7 layer was doing. The duplicate was also restricted to only half the colours normally available in Mode 7, 128 instead of the usual 256. So you might be thinking, well, that seems pretty useless. What's the point of even having that extra Mode 7 layer then? Well, the advantage of using this is that it allowed developers to specify parts of the second layer as a higher priority. What this meant is that sprites could go in between BG1 and BG2 at defined points. This is how, for example, the player can go under the bridge in the second level of Contra 3. It was only used in a handful of commercial games, however Super Turrican 2 has a couple of boss fights that really take advantage of this little used feature. This huge sandworm thing, for example. The worm's mouth is a Mode 7 background that scales and rotates, which is duplicated onto a second layer with the teeth specified to be a higher priority. So the player moves in front of the throat, but behind the teeth, looking like they are really inside its mouth. There's also this huge spider boss, which moves around behind the giant web, which is a Mode 7 background. The web isn't the only thing on that background though. You can also notice those purple stars. Those are also part of the Mode 7 tile map and are rotating with the web. As you can see, the giant spider moves in front of the stars but remains behind the web. In this case, it's the pixels that make up the web that are set up to be a higher priority, with the player character in this case set to be an even higher priority than that, so they remain on top of it. As the sprites could actually be set to a number of different priorities to appear in front of or behind background layers. On that subject, let's take a look at a couple of games that used Mode 7 and sprite priorities in some really creative ways. First up we have On the Ball, the international port of the arcade game Cameltry. As you can see, the object of the game is to guide a ball through a maze by rotating it, and the Super Nintendo port is actually quite good, even supporting the mouse for easier gameplay. Now, the Mode 7 part of this is pretty obvious. Clearly it's the rotating maze, but check out those backgrounds behind it, some of them are even animated. Mode 7 only supports one background, so how is that being done? It's actually a really clever use of sprites. As we've just seen, sprites can be either in front of or behind the background depending on what priority they are set to, and what the game is doing is setting up a scenery of sprites set to the lowest priority, so they appear behind everything else, with the ball set to the highest priority so it appears at the front. The rest of the background is filled up by just setting the background colour. Oftentimes when Mode 7 is used, the actual background colour is completely black, but it doesn't have to be. It can be any colour you want, really. Heck, it can even be multiple colours, as seen with this one. The brick pattern is made up of a combination of the background colour being grey with a number of black horizontal lines across it, and sprites that determine the edges and textures. And for the animated ones, obviously it's pretty easy to make sprites animate. It seems so simple, but it creates an incredible looking effect. Another game that makes really clever use of this technique that I wanted to analyse is Axelay. No, not those vertical scrolling stages, that's not Mode 7, and I cover what's actually going on in those stages in my video on games commonly mistaken for using Mode 7. What I actually wanted to look at in depth is the Stage 2 boss fight with this walker mech. Did you even realise this was using Mode 7? Well, it is, it's just incredibly well disguised. The mech's head segment is a Mode 7 background, which is what allows it to rotate like that, but there's plenty of other stuff going on in this scene, so let's break it down. The game uses the Super Nintendo's trick of being able to split the screen into multiple segments on specified scan lines to display a different background mode in each. The top portion of the screen, up to and including scanline 49, is displaying in Mode 1. Scanline 50 to 201 is the Mode 7 portion, then it splits again on scanline 202 to display Mode 1 again. The only part of the middle section of the screen that's technically a background is the mech's head. The mech's legs are made up of sprites, and so are those textures you see on the wall behind it, just set to the lowest priority so they appear behind everything else. The wall itself is just a solid background colour, set to that brownish hue instead of the usual black. While the usage of Mode 7 is often pretty obvious, it's more subtle uses like this, when combined with other hardware capabilities, that I think really showcase what the potential was in the hands of talented developers. So we've just looked at a game that split the screen to use different modes in their unique way. But the idea of doing this was actually pretty common when Mode 7 was in use, as you'd often see something like a sky, horizon, or perhaps a static HUD above a World 7 world map or racetrack. But you know, you didn't actually need to have different modes in each segment. You could have the same modes in each segment, and Mode 7 was no exception to this. So let's dig into a few games that split the screen into multiple Mode 7 segments, starting with Hyperzone. In this case, it's split a few times. You can see Mode 1 at the top for the HUD, Mode 7 for the ceiling, Mode 1 again for that thin strip in the middle, and Mode 7 again for the floor. As you can see, the Mode 7 portions are mirrored, and it's a pretty neat effect, but how's it done? Well, the first part of the puzzle is that the ceiling segment is just drawing the same as the bottom segment, but flipped, and the SNES actually provides native support for doing that. Easy enough, job done, right? Not quite, because this game also has vertical movement, so the player can move their ship up and down. When they do this, the perspective shifts accordingly. So if they move up, they can see a little further into the distance on the floor than they can on the ceiling, and if they move down, then the opposite is true. If we ignore the ceiling for a moment, doing this effect on just the floor is pretty easy, and plenty of games do something similar to this, making the ground larger as you get closer to it, or smaller as you get further away. So they're needing to perform two opposite calculations simultaneously in order to pull this off, restricting the player's viewpoint on one half of the screen while expanding it in the other half. Another interesting study is this underworld map in Terranigma, one of those rare cases of a game that never made it to North America but was released everywhere else. Once again, the screen is being split, this time with this pulsing sprite pattern to cover up the seam, which creates that curved effect on the horizon. The ground appears warped due to the player's viewpoint being in a kind of flattened semicircle shape rather than the triangle shape it normally is, combined with some HD matrix. It's basically the same thing Super Castlevania 4 does to create the famous spinning room effect. But that weird sky, that's a bit of a mystery. How's it doing that? If you look at it closely, it's actually doing the same kind of thing that we just saw Hyperzone doing. That is, it's mirroring the ground, and if we remove that blue tint on it, this becomes a lot clearer. Except it's disguised by actually mirroring what's slightly behind the player's current view, which is this pinkish area here, so the mirroring doesn't look obvious. So how are they making it blue then? Well, remember my video about how the SNES created transparency effects? That's exactly what's going on here. If we split the image up to separate the main screen and the subscreen, we can see what's happening. The main screen contains the ground map and has this blue gradient in its upper portion, while the subscreen contains the mirrored sky. colour mass is then applied between the main screen and the subscreen to turn the mirrored sky blue. Isn't that cool? I think that's insanely cool. As with other examples we've looked at, it's about utilising a number of features of the hardware to create something truly unique. If you want to know more about how the Super Nintendo's transparency effects worked, make sure you check out my video all about it. And while you're there, why not subscribe? Let's go from games that use the same Mode 7 textures on the top and bottom of the screen to a game that somehow uses different Mode 7 textures with Indiana Jones's Greatest Adventures. This game is full of impressive effects, but perhaps the most notable is this Mode 7 minecart level in a volcano area. And check it out, the lava floor and the rocky ceiling are two completely different textures. There's no mirroring or fancy colour mass tricks going on with this one, they're very much totally different. But this isn't two Mode 7 tile maps, because the Super Nintendo could only have one Mode 7 tile map in memory at a time. So how on earth are they doing this? Once again the screen is split to use Mode 1 at the top, then Mode 7 for the ceiling, then splits again to use Mode 7 for the lava floor. If we take a look at the Mode 7 tile map, we can see what's going on pretty clearly. Both the lava floor and the rocky ceiling are part of the same tile map, just in two different locations. So the game is set up to use the right side of the tile map for the upper portion and the left side for the lower portion by referencing their specific memory addresses. The game is able to do this because the player is quite literally on rails in this level, being pushed forward with no way to move side to side, and the view distance is restricted so you can't see the other side of the tile map. The lights on the walls are sprites that are being stored in a few different sizes in order to fake scaling, and this rounds out the overall effect nicely. It looks amazing, and it seems so simple to implement that it's actually quite strange it wasn't done more often. I honestly can't think of a single other game that does this. Speaking of, I also can't think of a single other game that does what the Japanese exclusive Melfand Stories does, with these Mode 7 levels on the back of a horse-drawn cart. Once again, the screen is split, although a bit differently this time, with Mode 7 at the top, Mode 7 again in the middle, and Mode 1 at the bottom for the HUD. It's doing the same kind of trick that Indiana Jones was doing, to be referencing two different parts of the tile map to effectively have two different Mode 7 textures, but check it out, it's performing a different Mode 7 calculation in each segment. It's scrolling the middle segment, like we just saw Indiana Jones doing, but scaling the top segment, so the destination looks like it's getting closer as the level progresses. It provides a sense of movement that other games just don't, and once again, I've got to wonder why it wasn't done anywhere else. If you know of any other games that do this, let me know in the comments. Melfand Stories also has another neat Mode 7 trick in the first level with these pirate crocodile enemies to jump off a ship in the background into the foreground to fight you. This is being done with Mode 7, it's not faking it with different size sprites. Once again we see a screen split here, and once again it's disguised quite well. Mode 7 is only used in the top part of the screen, above the water's horizon. Notice how there's no actual background here. The clouds in the sky are sprites, as are the ship's mast and the small versions of the enemies, and there's also a gradient on the sky using HDMA. This is because the game is currently pointing at a memory address of the Mode 7 tile map with nothing on it except a background colour. When the enemies in the background jump, they are animated jumping for a few frames before the sprite disappears and is replaced by the part of the Mode 7 background which contains their jump pose. This is then scaled with Mode 7 as it continues its jump arc until it reaches the required size, even going above the upper boundary of the screen. Notice how through the whole scaling process they never cross over that horizon line. The Mode 7 background then returns to pointing at nothing and is replaced by a sprite to finish the jump animation as they touch the ground. It's all very seamless, and it's another pretty creative implementation of the feature that we oddly didn't see too often. Let's stay on the subject of Super Famicom exclusives and examine the tennis game Ace Narae, based off the anime of the same name, which translates to Aim for the Ace. There are a few sports games that used Mode 7 like this game does, but this is one of the best executions of it. Not only does the camera rotate to follow the path of the ball, but the angle also changes. There is a screen split happening here, as the top portion of the screen where the crowds and backgrounds are is Mode 1, but the scan line where the split happens moves up and down depending on the action every single frame. It can move quite low to show quite a lot of the Mode 1 backgrounds, or it can even move right off the top of the screen so only the corners are visible. That's not the only interesting thing going on with this game though. Check out that net. That's not what you might think it is. That's not made up of sprites. I mean, the two poles on either side of it are, but not the net itself. Any guesses as to how the game is doing that? There's actually another clue on the screen that points us in the right direction on this, and that's the scoreboard in the top right. The actual numbers are sprites, but there's a transparent box around them. Yep, that's a window with colour maths applied inside it. In this case, it's colour subtraction. So now, if we look further down the screen to the net, we can actually see that it's creating long skinny windows across the screen, each just one scanline tall. Their left and right positions, or in other words where they start and end, are being updated every single frame as the camera moves. The windows become shorter or longer, particularly the ones at the top and the bottom of the net, depending on the angle of the camera, in order to show the net at the correct angle, with the same colour subtraction that's used on the scoreboard also applied. And to sell the illusion further, there's also lighter window lines in between the darker ones, with colour averaging applied instead, allowing you to see through the net more naturally. The game manages to still run at 60 frames a second despite this, which makes this window trick with the net almost invisible when the game is in motion. It's really amazing how creative developers were back then to seemingly achieve the impossible. On the subject of achieving the impossible, the last game I'll cover is Super Off-Road, the Baja. Not to be confused with the game simply titled Super Off-Road, which was an isometric racer, the Baja is a sequel to that original game, and based on the Baja 1000 race. It changed to use a third-person camera rather than a top-down one, which meant it was time for some Mode 7 action. However, as you can see, this game seemingly manages to create changes in elevation with hills and valleys. But Mode 7 is not supposed to be able to do this, it's just a flat 2D tile map. So what kind of code voodoo is going on here? There's a few elements to unpack with this, so let's go through them one by one. Firstly, obviously the screen is being split again here. Mode 1 at the top for the distant background and sky, Mode 7 in the middle for the track, and Mode 1 again at the bottom for the HUD. However, in this case, the split at the top for the horizon isn't static, it's actually changing and moving up or down like we just saw Narae doing. Secondly, HDMA is being used a number of times on specific scan lines going down the screen, to stretch or compress parts of the track to create the illusion of height. It knows where to do this as the tracks themselves use a form of height mapping, with predefined points where the elevation changes occur, which often coincide with texture changes too. Thirdly, the player's viewpoint is also constantly being updated to leave gaps so they can't see over hills. To expand on that third point, if you compare this to F-Zero for example, that uses a completely flat track, you can see the player's viewpoint remains constant. The lines gradually get farther apart the further into the distance you can see. But that's not what's happening in Super Off-Road, the Baja. The view lines can be compressed really tightly, or they can have big gaps between them. Or they can even have a group of tight lines, then a big gap, then another group of tight lines. This is how the game is ensuring that the player cannot see over the crests of hills, but can see more once they reach the top. Just like the HDMA manipulations, this is constantly changing whenever the game needs to render a new frame. On top of that, the game needs to account for physics changes when going up or down hills, and needs to change the car animations accordingly to match. There's a large amount of constantly changing data the game needs to keep track of whenever a new frame is drawn to the screen. So there's actually a lot of computations going on to achieve this result, which takes its toll on the hardware. You've probably noticed the game is running at a pretty poor frame rate. In fact, it's only managing to update the image every 5 frames, so it's only running at 12 frames a second, which is playable but not amazing, despite how good it looks. There are a few other games that tried a less complicated or better optimized implementation of this technique that managed to achieve some better frame rates, such as Super Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, Tommy Moe's Winter Extreme Skiing and Snowboarding, and Al Unser Jr.'s Road to the Top. But like the other tricks we've seen in this video, overall it was pretty rare. Okay, I think this video has gone on long enough, so I'll leave it there, but this is definitely a subject I might like to revisit in the future, as I really love digging into old games like this to see how they work. I hope you learned something from this video, and if you've ever wondered how some old games managed to do what they did, please drop them in the comments and maybe I can cover them. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.